This is not for your benefit, this is for Facebook's benefit, so they can hear what's being said.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. I'll stand over here too so those online can see me. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Cristobal Lopez. I am a Texas field representative for the National Parks Conservation Association. That is what I do for my 9 to 5, and starting next week, I will also be an assistant professor of practice in history at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So I will be teaching history as well. I'm super grateful to be here, and thank you to Margot and Diane and to the San Antonio Missions Indigenous Senate Group for opening up their space, to me and to us to be able to come in and share some of our work with you. As Margot mentioned, I was, one of the first ones that presented for the group 3 years ago, which it's crazy that it's been that, 3 years flew. And every opportunity that I have to be able to come and stand up here in front of y'all and just present about the work that I'm doing or the work that, I'm affiliated with, it really is such an honor to be able to share that. As a historian, I always say that I try to be a public historian, right? I try to be public facing with the work that I do. I think so much of that is showing, being able to collaborate and share our work with the public for y'all to be able to see the work that we do. It really helps build that bridge between the community and academia, right? And the work that goes on behind the scenes. And events like today and these sort of spaces are exactly those type of venues that we need to be able to, to share our work and to be able to collaborate. So, quick thing on the presentation today. If you saw the flyer, I just want to point out that this event is, hosted by the San Antonio Missions Indigenous Senate Group in collaboration with the National Parks Conservation Association. We are separate from the National Park Service. If you have not heard of NPCA, we are a separate 501c3 organization. We were founded in 1919, 3 years after the founding of the National Park Service by the first director of the Park Service as a separate organization. So we have different logos. Ours has bears, theirs has a buffalo. These bears are really cute. Michaela's also wearing a really cute logo. Yeah. So we are different organizations. So we are the National Parks Conservation Association. Also on the flyer, if you saw that today's presentation was going to be about Indigenous relations with national parks in Texas. That was the original plan whenever this was organized, I will say, a year ago. If y'all don't know how these presentations are booked, they're booked in a year advance because they're so popular. So Margot reached out to me early on about our presentation. So that was going to be the original topic, but some things happened and that was no longer going to be the case. And after panicking for like 10 minutes, because I didn't want to call Margot and Diane and be like, I don't have a presentation anymore. I remembered that I have two amazing colleagues within the National Parks Conservation Association in our Mid-Atlantic region that do this every day. Working with Indigenous communities and national parks is their role within the National Parks Conservation Association. And I thought, well, what great of an opportunity would it be to have them come to this space and share some of their work more nationally, and also to share some of the work that NPCA does more nationally. The work that we do is very dependent on region, on park site. It's really different across the country. We're surprisingly, I would say, a small organization. There's about 200 of us, I believe, give or take, and I think this is probably the most we've ever had. But we're spread out. We're spread out across the country, and our work really varies depending on region and national parks. So I reached out to Michaela and Katie and was like, hey, would y'all be willing to present about y'all's work to this just absolutely incredible group and community? And they welcomed the opportunity with open arms, and they were super excited about it. So they will be the main presenters for y'all today. I am just the host. I'm the face in person. So I have introductions. I would, of course, love to introduce them. I was going to introduce or read off their bios from my iPad, but for some reason it wasn't connecting, so I will be reading from my phone, just to let you know. So I'll begin with Katie, Katie Shea. Katie Shea is the National Parks Conservation Association Tribal Co-Management Policy Fellow, and Katie is a proud member of the Citizen Potawatomi? Did I say that correctly? Someone? Potawatomi Nation. Prior to joining NPCA, Katie served in the National Park Service as a Cultural Diversity Internship Program member at both Redwood National Park and the Office of Native American Affairs. Following her back-to-back appointments, Katie continued working with the Northeast region as a learned professional contractor. Through each of her stints, Katie's work has evolved to focus on the shared stewardship strategies and capacity building for long-lasting success. Katie's passion for stewardship and building relationships is largely influenced by her participation in the, say it one more time. Potawatomi. I would rather her say it than me say it incorrectly. Leadership program where she learned the values of culture and political sovereignty and the unique obligations to celebrate and further uphold those rights. This experience inspired her to study Indigenous peoples law at the University of Oklahoma and apply that knowledge to protect Native American heritage in the National Park Service. Katie firmly believes her closely held values of stewardship is reflected in her Potawatomi name. What was that?
Potawatomi name, and now don't play.
Which symbolizes her steadfast nature to strike balance and harmony in the boundless paths she ventures in life. So please join me both on stage. And now, Michaela Pavlot. Michaela Pavlot is the Indigenous Partnership Program Manager for the Mid-Atlantic region in NPCA, and she is a citizen of the. Oh, I'm just gonna let you. Yeah.
Let
me turn this up a little bit more. Okay. Michaela grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan along the shores of Lake Superior, enjoying the state parks and beaches. She graduated from Northern Michigan University with a Bachelor of Fine Arts with a concentration in drawing and painting. In her previous role, she served as an educator in the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and conducted programs to disseminate Indigenous histories and contemporary issues. So join me in welcoming. So, that's not my art. So I will turn it over to y'all. Y'all should have the ability to share screen, and if anything technical comes up, let me know.
Okay, perfect.
And if y'all have any issues listening, I know it's up.
Testing.
Yeah, let me go ahead and start speaking, and then if you can't hear me, I'll adjust my tone.
There we go. It wasn't. Okay.
That's good?
Can you guys hear?
Okay. Good. Thank you so much for having us. Cristobal, thank you for inviting us. I'm really excited to speak with you all. And I will say, Katie and I have slides and a presentation to share. But if you have any questions throughout, go ahead and raise your hand. And Cristobal, will you just interrupt us and field the question?
Okay.
Cool. All right. Some all about conversation. And with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Let me so I can see you. Can everyone see this? Okay. You should see the Indigenous engagement and tribal issues. Cristobal did really an amazing job of kind of introducing MPCA, so I might skip over that. But again, Cristobal, thank you so much for having us. My name's Michaela. You really covered a lot of what I do. In addition to some of the just like Indigenous partnership, is we have some Indigenous leader work. And yes, I am very obnoxious about where I come from. This is the Upper Peninsula, where I pointed to it, in Michigan. So I was born and raised in Sault Ste. Marie in my community. And that, and leaving home was really really tough. I'm now down in Maryland. I'm based in right outside DC, Washington DC, and that is quite the culture shock, being away from community. But I always found my people, always found work that supported my community and my personal values and my identity. For example, working at the National Museum of the American Indian, where I could talk and speak to people and educate people about my history, culture, and then like Indian country at large. And then I always wanted to do more. I loved educating. I loved talking to students, and I mean students of all ages that would come in and ask questions, and they were curious. But I wanted to take more of an action piece, which led me to the National Parks Conservation Association as an advocate and advocating for Indigenous rights in national parks, but also in other forms of advocating for Indigenous rights and sovereignty and conservation at large. And that's quite the task. And we have quite an amazing team to support that. And I'll get into that in a little bit about how we do this work, how we do it as a non-native, non-government organization, and who supports that. And then, Katie, do you want to say a little bit more about yourself while you have this beautiful portrait up?
Sure. I just want to echo some of Michaela's sentiments. Thank you all so much. When Cristobal shared this opportunity, I personally was excited because not this New Year's, but the last New Year's, I actually spent my honeymoon in San Antonio, and while visiting one of the missions, my husband and I had the opportunity, I can't remember who it was, so I apologize, but to listen to one of you share like your story and like your connection with the missions. And having growing up in Texas myself, north of Dallas, and my mom being a Texas history teacher, I had always wanted to learn more of that side of history because it's something that I simply did not get growing up. And so just thank you so much for having us here today. It personally means a lot to me. And yeah, MPCA, it's been a pleasure to work here because not only have I always wanted to do more of an advocacy role with my background in federal Indian law, whenever I worked for the National Park Service, especially for a regional office, which supports all the park units in that region, of the 2,200 employees, only 11 were Indigenous identifying, including myself. And of those 2,200 employees, I was the only one that had a background in federal Indian law. And so, as you can imagine, I had a lot of experience and exposure to just the simple fact that not a lot of folks have this knowledge of not only tribal history, but the different types of histories throughout the continental United States or Turtle Island. And so naturally, similar to Michaela, I felt this gravitation to MPCA because we can advocate and really have a role in educating about this area specifically. I'm not sure what else to add, but yeah, thank you.
That was perfect. Thanks for adding more. And then, of course, I just want to start off with kind of what we're alluding to, but it's really important to acknowledge also all the land we reside on is native land, but national parks are most definitely native land. And native people are still here, still thriving in the lands that we call our national parks, our people's homes, our traditional lands, our cultural lands, sacred lands. And beyond conservation, there's a role to protect that, and Indigenous peoples should be leading that way. In addition, Native people are still here, and the treaty signed between the United States and tribal nations are supreme law of the land, and so there is this government-to-government responsibility to understand and practice this beyond beyond that paper. So the National Park Service and even public lands in general, being part of the federal government, they have this obligation to work with tribal nations directly. And historically, we've seen patterns where they don't do the best job. We've seen a lot of growth. And again, like as Cristobal was saying, and I'll get into, it really is different everywhere you go. There are over 570 federally recognized tribes, and then there's state and non-recognized tribes. And there's so many different relationships with the federal, state, and local communities. And one thing that I talk about a lot and educate on is that piece of sovereignty and treaties, and what does that responsibility look like, and how do you follow through? You know, it's another thing that I really follow is what a chief shared with me one time. She is actually Lenape in Canada, but she said, you know, these treaties aren't just for the government to pay attention to and uphold. It's also citizens of, in her case, of Canada, but citizens of the United States, as we have hundreds of treaties that are broken, but you know, citizens also have a responsibility to know those rights and know about tribes and sovereignty. And so I really carry that into this work at a non-native, non-government organization, because there's a lot that we have a lot of shared values with, you know, when it comes to like conservation and protecting our lands. Like for example, go back. NPCA, first of all, does an amazing job introducing who we are in our history. So I'll go a little further. Our kind of vision is preserving our past and protecting our future. And for NPCA, they do that with over 1.6 million members and supporters that are voice of America's national parks and like working to protect and preserve our nation's, you know, iconic and beautiful places for future generations. And for me, as an Anishinaabe woman, we've always known this value of protecting for our future generations, right? It's called the 7 generations. And so we know our actions, our decisions, and the way that we think about our lives today is to benefit and have a positive impact on the 7 generations ahead. So coming to NPCA, I was like, this is like overlapping with who I am and supports my work. And what we do here at NPCA, and the way that we advocate for our lands and protection is very similar. So, you know, we also celebrate these places and spaces and work in community and also at government levels, and even, of course, it's, you know, in community like where you are, or it's in the courtroom, or here in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, where we bring these issues and ensure that we are heard and that we're speaking for these wonderful places. I'm just going to skip real quick, because well, we kind of covered who we are and our mission. But when it comes to Indigenous engagement at NPCA, this really happens at various levels. You know, there's different departments at our organization. We all belong, like Cristobal, myself, and Katie, all belong to regional programs. There's 11 regions across the United States that works on the ground. So we have people in Alaska, in California, I'm here in DC, Katie's in Georgia, and we have and folks in Michigan, all on the ground to kind of work on these issues, to be in community. And then we have other departments that support us, like government affairs, which does a lot of the work here in DC on the Hill, and speaking to Congress members. But we also do that. We have Lions. If we have an issue, we come in and bring community members to come in and speak their truth. And then of course we have like comms, and in those times we have legal to bring this to the courtroom, to take care of this, to really ensure that we are protecting our places and spaces. So each of these departments and staff works with tribes in one way or another. So either we're working with tribal members to to learn more about a shared issue, and we can assist in ways that we can communicate that issue, or it's also uplifting Indigenous voices and Indigenous work, and also the work that's going on in our national parks with Indigenous park rangers or Indigenous programs. And so there's ways that comps can write like blogs or articles to tell these stories. And like I said, regional program staff kind of do it all. We assist in uplifting and sharing those stories. We assist in lead a lot of the communication around these issues. And so I just kind of want to lay out who we are in our regions. So again, I said we have 11 regions across the country with several staff on the ground. And so at NPCA, we collaborate and work with dozens of coalitions and tribes in these community spaces to protect national parks and to conserve our lands. So, and again, when it comes to tribal nations, if you look at these regions, everyone has their own relationship with local tribes and Indigenous communities. Recently, we have worked with over 150 tribes and several tribal organizations. And many of these campaigns are the way that we work with community is to do just that. It's to protect our parks, but also for us and Indigenous people, it's protecting our culture, our tradition, lifestyle, and sacred spaces. So, we might have kind of different reasons for why we do this work. For like NPCA, we're anchored in our mission, which is, protecting the parks, and then for tribes, it's much more than that. It's protecting sacred lands. So, as this non-government organization such as NPCA, we play a really unique role in working with tribal nations and being good allies. Because historically, like, tribal nations and NGOs did not have some overlap or work closely together, and especially because there's just a difference of relationships. For example, as I mentioned, tribal nations work directly with governments because of their sovereign and trust and obligations. So state and federal governments must work with tribal nations and in the name of sovereignty. And then in that relationship, in that work, NGOs do not have a role in the sovereign to sovereign meetings. But what we can do is support, if invited in, support tribal nations in preparation, in public comment process, advocating on the Hill, financial support for capacity and resources. Because that's one beautiful thing about NPCA is we have brilliant people. We have brilliant people that cover different, conservation programs, different areas, focus areas that can share that information where a tribal nation might not have the capacity to do that research or to have that expertise because of, let's say, like staffing. So for me as a Native person at an NGO, it is a really interesting kind of push and pull of wanting to do what I know as an Indigenous person and what I know about my sovereign right. And that coming from, like a non-government organization, like, well, there's a barrier because I am not in, like a tribal role, so I can't engage in the government-to-government conversation. So one thing that we really do, and Katie and I play a major role in this, is getting NPCA to also learn and know how to work with tribal nations. So I have like this internal education. So we run an Indigenous engagement team, which is an internal space for NPCA staff to learn about tribes, tribal engagement, how to communicate with tribes, how do we talk about a certain issue. So it's a lot of guidance on how to do this work. And part of that is also knowing where we stand as a relationship to tribal nations and to the federal government. So when it comes to tribal issues, as an NGO, we are never taking the lead on tribal issues. We are, again, we can definitely support tribal nations. It's always kind of like behind the scenes support, because, again, that's not our place, and tribal nations oftentimes don't even need our help. So, it's an understanding of, that relation and that role, and that is being a good partner, right? Is understanding our place and our role in this work. So when it comes to, for me, right, like as a non-Native person and with sovereign issues and treaty rights, my passion is very personal. It's and this work to work on protecting our lands and our rights comes from a different place, and we carry that passion through NPCA and support tribal voices to advance those issues in a respectful way. And there have been several campaigns or issues that NPCA has worked on in the last couple of years that have really shown that. And so I'm going to talk about them a little bit. But before I get into like specific examples, Katie, do you want to hop in and share anything of some of your personal?
Sure, yeah, I was just going to say, I'm getting reverb, maybe it's just on my end. It's an interesting role that NGOs play, especially in environmental conservation, because when you look at the span of history with the United States, from like colonization to westward expansion, there's been a common narrative or a bias that often displaces Native experience or Indigenous knowledge. And so now where we're at, especially with NGOs, kind of touching to Michaela's point earlier, right, of like traditionally there hasn't been a lot of overlap, but in recent years, there's been a lot of synergy taking place, recognizing like, hey, like tribes and environmental NGOs, we have a lot of shared goals. We want the environment to be taken care of. We want tribes to have their rights in these spaces recognized. And especially as we look, in our role at NPCA, as we focus on the National Park Service, this agency and really the Department of Interior by and large, when we look at the history of the displacements of Native people, whether it be through treaties, to create reservations, to create national parks, this was an exchange of lands in turn for rights and protections. And so whenever we look at supporting tribes now to uplift those rights, a lot of them it's looking at these different like sectors of law and policy, and then also really like helping us develop our internal competencies of like, hey, when we're working with superintendents, like our park partners who may only have like a little bit of knowledge from their 4th grade social history class or social studies class of like what tribes are, like how can we develop their understandings of, hey, the Park Service has a legal obligation through those treaties, through those doctrines, and flowing from the Constitution and extra constitutional rights. How can we reduce that and like help our park partners fulfill their obligation to tribes? And that takes a lot of our own internal education development, because like I relate with Michaela. I mean, of the many employees we have, I think there's 4 or 5 of us that are Indigenous identifying, and so we take a lot of our passion, but a lot of hard work, and making sure our team understands this backgrounds when we work with tribes, but more importantly our park partners, all these understandings, we have like a nice foundation established. Yeah, I think that's all I have to add.
Thanks. Well, yeah, and also, does anyone have any questions before conversation? Cool.
I was just wondering about non-federally recognized tribes, how you all interact and advocate for them.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we work with across, and I think it's different across regions. I can actually share a little bit about my experiences. Actually, I get that's a great transition of like the work I do in the Mid-Atlantic region, which we have, I think we have close to 5 state recognized tribes. There's 7 federally recognized tribes in Virginia, and then there's state recognized in Virginia and Maryland. And there are many parks in that area that work with state and federally recognized tribes. When it comes to like NPS, we always ensure that they are working, with the federal obligation, which is consulting with federally recognized tribes. But many times it's also a state tribe that is in relationship there. Like for example, at Piscataway Park, Piscataway is the name of a tribe, and they work really well with Piscataway Nation to have either like educational pieces or access and in keeping in track with them. For us at NPCA, we work with them as as partners too, and supporting in many ways. I think so. For us in Maryland is thinking about how to support some of their shared values in you can even say in state legislators. So sometimes we can support them in that state level, state policies. Katie, you want to jump in?
So I was just going to add, and I was going to lightly touch on this in one of my slides later, but when we think of shared stewardship or doing work collaboratively together, under the Biden-Harris administration, there's a lot of policy that actually updated some of the language specifically for the Park Service. Because even though the Department of Interior has a legal obligation for federally recognized tribes, because the recognition process, which was of course the rules written by the federal government, was a very arduous process to basically give you recognition. So that's where we have this dichotomy of state and federal recognized tribes. However, in the recently updated language, since there's just so many different communities that don't fall under state or federal recognition, like when we look at Native Hawaiian organizations, or we look at communities in Alaska, they somehow don't fit in this process that the government prescribed itself. And so there's a lot of, even though I'm not familiar with exact examples at MPCA, I do know there's a lot of mobilizing on the ground with projects in communities that might, similar to the communities in San Antonio, right? They might not have these big stamped recognitions. I'm trying to find the right terminology for it, but there's still examples of the government saying, hey, these communities have ties to this place. We need to honor their story in fulfilling our mission of telling the shared experience or people's stories in America at these sites. Which is important to note because historically that was not commonplace. It was you have to be federally recognized, and now we're starting to broaden who we're bringing in to work with us, which I think is wonderful.
Thanks for bringing up that update, Katie. That's such a good point. Because a lot of our work, right, we're with the National Parks Conservation Association, but part of when we get into regions is you get into coalitions, which is so for example, in the Mid-Atlantic, belong to the Choose Clean Water Coalition. And you're absolutely right. Those waterways touch federally, state, and even some non-recognized tribes. And so we work at at different levels of different partnerships to include and involve tribes, but also Indigenous knowledge. That's one thing we have not talked about yet, Katie, and I feel like that's another whole presentation, which is that shared relationship and shared work as a conservation organization, and working with tribes, because there has been a massive push to incorporate and include Indigenous knowledge in management, in land management, in water, and even some climate change efforts. So when it comes to those, to implementing Indigenous knowledge. It is most definitely in the closest relationship and respect with tribes leading as well. We really talk about Indigenous knowledge in a bit. I kind of shared a bit about my work already. Another one that I just wanted to share about, like, what does some of the work look like across NPCA. In Alaska, there's a campaign called Protecting the Brooks Range, or No Ambler Road, which is a 211-mile prime road that cuts through 8 of the Arctic, but also several Alaskan villages. And many of these Alaskan natives oppose this road. And this is something that NPCA was working on their own from, the park perspective, and then found that Indigenous voices were not probably being heard. So we were really in close relationship trying to figure out how to work with Alaska Natives, and also get this process, this like federal, like the public comment process, to people in community, because these are extremely isolated rural areas, and sometimes the communication of, let's say, like the proposal of the road, because it's federal lands, that goes to the public, that goes to the community for input, and it wasn't reaching tribal people. So one thing that we on the backside we're doing is like advocating to ensure access to information, access to sharing their perspective. Because many times it's like write in and submit to this database, but Alaska actually advocated for like phone lines, so people could call in to share their voice. And then, of course, another part of this is getting in front of people. We had many fly-ins with Alaska Natives down here in DC to get them in front of their representatives, and many others, as this turned into a larger campaign, with even the National Defense Authorization Act getting involved. So there's a way that we could support by getting people down here to DC to speak to those people, and that is one way that we had this shared issue. We wanted to protect this caribou herd, and that as like their migration pattern, and then the Alaskan Native, that's their subsistence, that's their food. And so we prioritized their voices and took a back seat so they could share their perspective of why they were fighting for the road. And then another example is our Suncoast team down in Everglades and Big Cypress that assists in building relationships and creating some space for tribal nations and NPS to build relationships, which led to further protection and access to traditional lands and plants, and even co-management agreements. And then that kind of leads me to another step that I appreciate the question earlier about, like, well, how do we work with state recognized, and then also how do we work with the tribal organizations, because there are many tribal owned NGOs or tribal owned businesses to be in partnership with. Some of the bigger ones are, the Native American Rights Fund, which Katie will talk about, and the National Congress of American Indians, which is a major space where we continue to learn and be in good partnership to advocate for tribal rights and issues, and also the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And this is also one that kind of bridges departments, not just, it's actually Katie's role specifically, but government affairs supports, we say NASPO for short, but to ensure appropriate appropriation. There's a lot of the programs that benefit tribal nations, like Tribal Historic Preservation Office or Native American Graves repatriation acts come from the Department of the Interior's budget. And that's something that our government affairs really works on, is to continue to advocate for that support. So our preservation, and we can really protect our areas and spaces. And then I also just put here like our regional partners, as the 11 regions hold many different relationships. It's a lot to list. But NPCA continues to build this trust in relationships and supporting and really in whatever way is needed and appropriate. I'm gonna pass it to Katie, but any other thoughts, questions?
Anybody else have any questions?
Yes.
There's no questions.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no questions?
Yeah.
Well, cool. Michaela, actually, if you want to keep it on the previous slide for a second, I can kind of start off and talk about some of the partnerships, because in our work, especially with the Park Service, there is just, I feel like I could have a whole webinar series to talk about this. I'll try to keep it very precise, but so my role as the Tribal Co-Management Policy Fellow, there's a lot of things that after coming into the position, it kind of I feel like it has become something where I wear many hats, right? Because it's not just about focusing on policy for this type of strategy, but it's also understanding how MPCA can work with the Park Service and the programs it administers. I'll talk about the Native American Rights Fund in a second, but just to touch on the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, a mouthful. It's interesting because in this pattern and this history of moving Native peoples and removing them from their land, and when these parks are created or units or sites, often through the management of that site, you unveil a lot of archaeological sites. You find a lot of history or view sheds or landscape that is deeply tied to Native people. And so this program, short-term like NAFPO, the acronym for it, the National Park Service administers this program, and a portion of that funding is to create officers for tribal nations, essentially to liaise or communicate and work with park units to make sure when you have an archaeologist or historian, or in a more boring but technical sense, if the park has to put up, a bathroom or a visitor center or put a road through, and they do the digging and they find an artifact or they find a burial mound, that is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is the dedicated person for the tribe affiliated with that unit or that area to work with the park, and the park gets an idea of, hey, how does the tribe want to approach this? How do we want to make sure we're preserving your history? And even though that's just one technical example, there's many other ways that the Park Service works with them, right? When you look at exhibits, museums, oftentimes the TIPOs or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers are the ones that the park unit will consult with and say, hey, do you have a group of elders you want to bring in to kind of approve what we're talking about, or how do you want your story to be told? As we know in history books, a lot of time the narrative have been dominated and told in someone else's, typically a white person's perspective that has no relationship with the tribe or the true understanding of what has taken place there, or from the tribal perspective. And so the partnership we have with NAFPO, as I'll get into later, it's a very interesting experience and just so much work to be done. I guess we can go with the next slide now. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm the Tribal Co-Management Policy Fellow. This work is really interesting because it focuses on what I like to call the shared stewardship strategy, because there's just many different ways to approach this. But the forefront of my work, or at least in my job description, is to collaborate with the Native American Rights Fund on education and outreach, essentially by developing resources and providing technical assistance for both tribal and federal representatives on co-stewardship and co-management agreements. For those who might not know about the Native American Rights Fund, NARF was established in 1970 It is a nonprofit legal organization that provides representation to Native communities, and whether it be district courts or Supreme Court, and is a respected consultant to policymakers and NGOs like ourselves who are engaged in drafting legislation. So that arguably NARF, when you work with tribal communities throughout the country, anytime you see their logo, a lot of folks like myself are like, okay, like we know we're in a trusted space, we know that we have a lot of legal experts. I have a lot of admiration for this organization personally because the more you get to learn about federal Indian policy, and I still feel like I have a lot to learn even after going to law school, this is a type of field where it's still really, it's extremely nuanced for one, and two, it's very, I would say still in its infancy because federal Indian law and just the practice of tribal courts is roughly, you're looking at 50, 60 years old in terms of its like lifespan. And so when the founder of NARF, who still works with NARF, John Echo Hawk, and many of the staff attorneys, in the 1970s, they essentially were just building or flying the plane while they were building it, so to speak. And so it's really neat to have a partnership with them because, especially in environmental policy or like our work as an NGO focused on conservation, the more you peel back the layers, there's actually a lot of policy that affects tribes, not only because of treaty rights, but for tribes that do not have treaties, there's still this terminology or this doctrine that's called implied or inherent rights. So even if a tribe does not have a treaty, if there was something that happened environmentally that was near their reservation or their homelands that they still have rights to in a roundabout way, the tribe has every right to act on that. And so NARF is a really wonderful partner because there's a lot of areas in PCA, especially with the Park Service, that we're starting to enter this new era of realizing, hey, like this affects tribes and this voice, like it's not going to get any quieter. And so in a good sense, we need to lean into this common sense and work together to not only honor the sovereignty of tribes, but have this sense of allyship because as we know in our climate today, the environment just needs a lot of help. And so having a more holistic approach can make this like a really good place for us. And so a little bit about my work specifically, outside of just like leading the partnership with NARF or Native American Rights Fund, the goal of this is to support NPCA's growth and organizational development by building competency on tribal sovereignty, so the rights of tribes, and cultural sensitivity, which is fundamental for understanding Indigenous history and experience, even outside of the context of the Park Service, right? And so I would say, in a roundabout way, another goal of mine, or the fellowship itself, is to deepen NPCA's capacity and awareness, so whenever it is appropriate and when invited, we understand how to engage in this intersection between federal Indian policy and issues on public lands like the Park Service. Let's see, I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. So I'll try to spare all the boring legal stuff for what shared stewardship is, but I like to use this term intentionally because in recent years, especially in this last administration, or the Biden-Harris administration, people typically lean towards the term co-management, which is like the name of my fellowship. And so in a broad sense, just taking like a 30,000-foot view of stewardship, stewardship itself means, and the fun term for the department or the Department of Interior, basically just means activities relating to the management, decision-making, and like conservation, preservation of lands, waters, resources. And so when we think of the idea of shared stewardship, there's really, I think of like a spectrum of like what that can look like. And so going from like the top, bottom, and the broadest sense of the umbrella to the narrowest sense, I want to start with collaboration, which from what my understanding of the work that you all do actually kind of fits into, which is really cool and extremely fitting. And so collaboration in the broadest sense can be done anywhere, especially depending on relationships. And I think of it as working collaboratively in the spirit of fulfilling shared goals of recreation and educational activities. And so an example I think of, and excuse me, my background's in cultural resource management, focuses on developing, let's see, educational activities, programming, events. When I worked at Redwood, we always had a lot of folks from the community that the park would reach out to and say, hey, like we want to have some folks come to our visitor center and just spend an hour a week talking with folks about like their experience living in the area or like how their history tied to this place, or they'll host events that focus on like a cultural celebration, like marking, like celebration of like a, I can't remember the term, but just a lot of different events and ways you can collaborate without necessarily needing like an actual legal binding document. It's more of just like a, hey, we have a really good relationship, and I feel like in this space it's more appropriate for you to tell your story than for me to do it. And so that's kind of like if you're starting in the stewardship, that's kind of like a broad sense of it. I know that we'll be taking a break here at the half hour. Should I go ahead and should I just like reach a stopping point? Because this is going to take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, if we can go ahead and take a quick break, we'll be back in about 5 minutes if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
That's okay.
We're going to take a 5-minute break. If you guys want to get up, stretch, go to the bathroom, get some more coffee, more sweet bread, whatever works for you to get your recharge. Yes, there is a lot of pan dulce.
Cool. Thank you all. We'll take a quick break. I can just mute, but I'll leave the camera on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
How do we reach them? Huh? I'm sure I'll ask them to see if they provided their contact at the end.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, they can, I'll text her, see if they provide their contact again, and if not, then I'll ask them to. I'll text you.
Please, I believe we still have coffee and we still have sweet bread.
She liked it? Oh, I bet it was. Nothing to read at all.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah, like,
Okay, so it's not part of the
yeah, you did this with Ray when he was great. we already have all this year booked, but we have our calendar for the first 6 months of the year. So if you want one, please let me know so I can give you a calendar.
Although I sit right behind you.
Yeah, that's right. We see each other at the stuff videos all the time. We see each other.
Oh, yeah, Alexander. Danny, and I looked at, oh, it is Danny. Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, yeah. At first I was like, I'm not sure, and then I looked at it, I thought, oh, it is him, okay. But it's funny, she says, okay. I was like, it's okay. So, but I'm glad we're here. Yeah, thank you.
I submitted a review form, but I never received a confirmation that with their emails. So I just looked at the double check. Yeah, I know, right? The $100 a month that they take out. Did y'all renew? We did. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the Jumbotron with the final black spot. Yeah, another solid field.
feel like I know that there's some like restructuring of the team, which is good. So rough.
We went to Colorado Springs last spring break, and their stadium is really cool.
Really?
Yeah.
Like this apartment complex, they're kind of moves over and stays so people are renting it.
Switchable.
Yeah, that's what that's, yeah. It's a really, I really wish that the bar would play there so they could make this something bigger. Yeah.
Ready?
Okay, let's get started.
And my husband just retired, so I'm trying to find space for him.
All right, I think we're ready to get started. Yeah.
Perfect.
For Michaela to put the slides back up too.
And here we go.
And then could you make them full screen again? I don't know how you did that
Oh,
last
yeah.
time.
Yes, sorry about that. Good.
Perfect, thank you.
No, that's a good time to take a break, so I didn't want to lose anyone. I know sometimes it can be very dense or dull talking about some of the legal stuff behind this, but if we are all good to go, I'm happy to get started or pick back up.
Yep, good to go.
Perfect. So, starting off, I think I just talked about collaboration and how that's essentially the broadest sense. Because a precursor to co-stewardship or co-management I often talk about is it takes a lot of law and policy to kind of facilitate an agreement between the tribe and the park unit to make sure that the mutual understanding it's on paper, and sometimes it requires funding and it just becomes this huge process. So in a broadest sense, a collaboration is really nice, kind of low stakes, and it's a wonderful opportunity to build relationships and still have the opportunity for folks who are descendants of that community to come in and not only be involved and reconnect to that space, but to also share their story with folks who are visiting the area. So that kind of leads us to the more known term co-stewardship, and this is where it starts to get into more like approaching the legal binding documents. But the definition of co-stewardship in a plain sense is it refers to collaborative or cooperative arrangements between bureaus or agencies and tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. And this is related specifically to shared interests in managing, conserving, and preserving federal lands and waters. I try not to use the legal term, but it's kind of nice, kind of boring, but kind of nice. And so co-stewardship, it's still like collaboration, it's still broad, it applies to a lot of different things. But this is where it starts to get into like thinking of working with a bureau or especially an agency like the Park Service when it comes to managing a resource, whether it be in public lands, which is like typically the mindset people have with co-stewardship. There's a lot of processes and like management policies that everyone in the agency has to abide by. So when you think of collaboratively taking care of a space, a lot of folks in the agency don't like relinquishing some of that process or thinking like, okay, who's going to be in charge of what? Who's going to pay for this resource? Or how are we going to, who's going to pay for the trucks and the chainsaws to go out on the trails and go do this? And so it takes a little bit more of a concerted effort to decide who's doing what and where. And sometimes with co-stewardship, it takes an approach of starting with who has rights to this area. And so typically with federally recognized tribes, we look at treaty rights and other obligated interests, or sometimes it's just an approach to give opportunities for folks to come back in and reconnect and do kind of what I describe as like cultural revitalization, being able to do like trail management or be more involved with the decisions that are made on resources. Like my start, for instance, I came at this from a cultural resource way. In the National Park Service, there's this dichotomy of resources. You have natural resources and then you have cultural resources. And under that umbrella, you typically think of like museums, education, artifacts, like what's on exhibit, what's going to be held in a repository, or like where everything's stored basically. And so when we think of co-stewardship in that way, it's a very popular approach because communities want the opportunity to come in and decide how those artifacts or objects of cultural significance are taken care of. And so in the most narrowest sense, thinking of co-management, this is where it also has a lot of law and policy back behind it. But it's narrow because this option specifically requires federal authority or otherwise established law that allows the federal government to delegate authority to tribes, a level of authority. And so when you look at, if you focus just on the second and third, trying to compartmentalize here. So co-stewardship, all are based on the idea of, hey, we want to come at this together so we can have, you know, more holistic approach and taking care of these resources and managing them. But when you look at the difference of the two, co-stewardship is focused on just doing the work together, and then co-management is still doing the work together, but the government is giving tribes a degree of authority and decision making. And it's interesting, this is kind of the first time that it's done in a more like political sense. The history of this really has become, I guess like going back to the 60s in the Northwest, there were what's called the fish wars, and a lot of these rights, especially in treaties, the states didn't want to abide by because states in this, I should just back up to give like a brief history lesson. So in the background of co-management, we think of cooperative federalism. So we have the federal government, we have state governments, and then we have tribal governments, okay? And so when it comes to treaty rights, which are between tribes and the government, the federal government, these are rights that are going to be acknowledged and practiced or exercised between both sovereigns, right? And so back in the 60s in the Northwest, and pretty similar in the Great Lakes as well, we had a lot of tribes experience state authorities coming in and saying, hey, like, you can't fish, or hey, if you fish, you can only do so much, you can only catch and keep like so many. And this raised a lot of issues, and actually went to the Supreme Court, both with tribes in the Northwest and with tribes in the Great Lakes region. And so basically what came out of that was case law, which if you look, this is the boring legal part, but I kind of find it fascinating. So when you look at Supreme Court cases, they have legal standing similar to treaties and the Constitution, which means they are the highest law of the land and you have to abide by them. And so when we think about co-management, some of the misconceptions about that is that the government's just kind of willy-nilly giving tribes like authority to make decisions, when in actuality, this delegation of authority is extremely narrow and it's only based on federal policy or case law, like where it's explicitly delegated. And I appreciate giving this like boring, dull definition because I find in my work a lot of folks are scared, like, oh, they're just going to give land back, and it's like, that would be nice, but it's extremely narrow. And so I think I'll go to my next slide. So stewardship in general is essentially the idea of working together in a concerted effort with our shared visions and shared goals of how we want like conservation to look like, how we want our cultural resources to be managed, making sure that, you know, I feel like it's safe to say a lot of us have really high standards and high goals and aspirations of, hey, we just want to take care of things, right? And so we peel back the layers from the legal perspective, and we look at the big picture of why is shared stewardship important? Like, why has it gained a lot of popularity, especially in the last 5 years? Most importantly, my first point is sovereignty, like touching back on these obligations that are set in this term called the federal trust responsibility, which, if I repeat myself, I apologize, but for those who might not know what the federal trust responsibility is this legal doctrine idea that when the government, way back to the colonial period, were making treaties with tribes to legitimize their own existence as the United States to Europe, like all the powers in Europe, like France and Britain, it's this idea of recognizing that tribes have inherent powers. Even before people came to Turtle Island, tribes had their own government systems. We had leadership, there's structures, there's policies. It might not have been written down, but it was a system that had been going on for generations, right? And so when we entered into treaties, and there's this recognition of rights and obligations, that's when this terminology coined. And so henceforward, with all of these like new colonists coming in, and fast forward to land becoming states, there's always this recognition that's underlying that, hey, no matter what, the treaties are the law of the land, and the government committed itself in these treaties, in this unique legal standing relationships, that there's going to be a set of obligations that come, right? Whenever we have to think of people encroaching on tribal lands, the federal government has to say, hey, like, you're a citizen of the United States, you can't go on this land, or hey, you committed a crime, you can't do that. And so that kind of applies to a unique subset of like responsibilities in the Park Service as well. Let's see. Sorry, I get so wrapped up in it. I love it. The next point I'd argue of why this is important is a holistic approach. I am not an expert by any means in climate change, but I think it's fair to say that with the environment and everything's on fire, it seems like these days, or just in general, making sure that at any park unit, I want to say there's close to 500 park units, or 450, 500 park units in the care of the Park Service. And so when you look at all the different unique needs of each unit, because some might just be historical homes, some might be a view shed, there's a lot of ranging needs that are felt in these different units. And so when we think of broadening and leveraging different perspectives and expertise from a management standpoint, government officials, or, as we like to say, just like feds, there's like a unique perspective that is had. After working for the Park Service, I definitely have experienced this, where sometimes it's just seen, a unit is seen as, we just have to check the box, right? When we're managing something, we have to make sure that we're following all of our guidelines, we're following all of the law and policy for like environmental concerns or historical preservation concerns. But when we open up that aspect of thinking of like how we're approaching something, I find the use of Indigenous knowledge and how that has changed like drastically the landscape of management and like decision making. I feel that especially when we look more to like the natural resource side of the Park Service, like what comes to mind is the bison management strategy in Yellowstone. Having the opportunity myself to go out there and see bison on the range and hear from tribal representatives and folks who work at Yellowstone, like, hey, after we like started working collaboratively, there's a lot of knowledge that tribes have that we didn't really necessarily think about, because our stuff is based off of like Western knowledge and Western like science, different ways of thinking. And so a more holistic approach, it's interesting because you get to have more voices in the room as to like, hey, how should we approach this? Maybe change things up. And so the next thing that kind of flows into is capacity. One thing I always joke about, I feel like there's this common saying of like, nobody's working, but everyone's hiring, or something along to that extent, or we're just like overworked and understaffed. And I feel like this is a very like one unique thing that overlaps with both tribes and federal agencies, right? As we experience with, and I've seen with my friends in the Forest Service, hiring has gotten just so bad because of budget cuts and underfunding, that some agencies are not even able to have seasonals like work in the summer this upcoming year. And so when we think of how that affects the management of these landscapes, and I should back up, same for tribes too. Tribes operate similar to the United States government. Many tribes have, out of their inherent sovereignty, they can choose how they want to design and exercise their government. Like my tribe specifically, we have a constitution that is pretty similar to the United States, and then we have a governance system that has like executives, we have legislators, we have a judicial branch. And so when you think of how we work collaboratively, there's a lot of issues that tribes share in capacity. Sometimes, like, for instance, they might have a department that focuses on education. They might have a department that focuses on cultural resource management, natural resource management, and they too often have people where it's like, hey, we only had funding for one full-time employee this year, and this person's consulting with multiple agencies, federal, state, local, like municipalities. And so when we think of across the board kind of doing like a comparative list, when it comes to capacity and having bodies in the room or funding to implement a program, both tribes and agencies like really feel this need. And so co-management, co-stewardship is a very interesting, innovative solution to this because it allows us to share or pool resources and people. For instance, when I worked at Redwood, which is managed by state parks or California State Parks, the National Park Service, and with a few agreements, the Yurok Nation and Tolowa Deni, I think one more tribe as of recently, they're able to kind of cover certain areas to make sure, like, hey, if this is something that we're lacking on, how about we sign an agreement and you have people come in, like from your tribe, and work on restoring this trail or taking care of this, and we can share trucks, we can share chainsaws, we can share this, so that way you don't have to spend the money to do kind of like just sharing to make sure we're not overspending or like utilizing what we have, right? And that's kind of what my initial buy-in to co-stewardship was. I saw in the field how effective this was, and I was like, wow, especially with the environmental issues we're facing, this is a very practical solution, if you will, for taking care of our lands. And last but certainly not least, I did these in no particular order, is human experience. I feel that this is, from a tribal perspective, arguably one of the most important cornerstones to co-stewardship, because for so long, not only have we been displaced from our lands, kicked out of our lands, but we have this opportunity to come in and not only, as I like to say, like I hear in the field, instead of rewriting it, we're rewriting it to correct this narrative that for so long had got it wrong. Like, we're going in and we're saying what we want to say about our own experience and telling things from our perspective and not like a dominant culture, like Western culture perspective. But most importantly, we have the opportunity to revitalize our own culture. Just like a quick, I think the anthropologist background in me thinks of the connections of culture, especially Native communities, right? My tribe, similar to Michaela, we're both Anishinaabe tribes. We're from the Great Lakes region. Even though my tribe was removed and our last stop was in Oklahoma, Potawatomi traditionally came from the Great Lakes. Like my tribe specifically, I'm a descendant of a community that's in present-day Chicago, Illinois. And so when you think of the patterns of removal and people think of our history being based in the Great Lakes, our language being based off of the environment that we were around, and having someone like me who grew up in Texas or Oklahoma, for example, and I'm learning Potawatomi languages, I'm like, like thinking of what these words mean and translate to, like the environment's completely different than what it's actually based off of or inspired by. And so when you think of cultural revitalization in the lens of co-stewardship, co-management, you get to bring and have practices of bringing youth or anyone from tribal communities back into the space where their culture pretty much originated, which is extremely powerful when we think of language loss, cultural loss, from multiple instruments of government programs to try to extract that knowledge, to make sure that knowledge is not continuing on to further generations, or just simply because when tribes were removed, especially to Oklahoma, for instance, like my tribe had been, you just don't have that opportunity to transmit or to make sure that education goes to the following generations, which kind of goes into that point of reconnecting. So I won't go too far into that. So I think that's in a nutshell kind of like my work with tribal co-management, background of what it is, or stewardship in general, what that looks like. I think I just had one more slide. I hope I didn't bore anyone to sleep.
Amy, I want to add on to what you teed up so beautifully, which is telling these stories and the power of reconnecting and bringing people back to their homelands. And I think we be remiss to not mention the designation that happened a couple weeks ago. I think because you just put it so perfectly, like the stories that need to be told, and President Biden declared Carlisle Indian Boarding School to be a national monument. And that's based over here in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, and that's where so many Native kids were displaced and forced into the school. And now, with that story, NPS is really tasked with telling the story of thousands and thousands of children and from hundreds of different tribes. So it's a lot of work, and a lot of work that is extremely sensitive and traumatizing, and we are, awaiting the process to ensure that tribal voices and Native people are leading and telling the story, and again, like, controlling that narrative. But Kitty, you said that, and I'm like, I can't really win anybody, so I'll go to the next slide for you.
Thank you. It's very important because that's one thing I kind of debated on talking about today, because the legacy of boarding schools, ironically, is a dark and tragic legacy, and it was an instrument to systematically extract that knowledge when these children were forcibly removed and strategically placed across the country, so if they were to run away, they wouldn't be familiar with their surroundings, unfortunately, or speak languages with the other children that were from different tribes at that school. And the legacy of that, that's one of many things that contributed, not just with the relocation itself, but with these institutions. It's just a lot of knowledge that folks, like myself growing up in Van Alstyne, Texas, went to Dallas, but all my family being in Oklahoma, my grandmother was very proud. She's like, we're Potawatomi. You need to learn about our history. You need to get involved with the tribe. And our tribe was merely just but property and a double wide that had documents of tribal enrollment. And so for me growing up and seeing that, I never could make the connection. I was like, well, Potawatomi, like, aren't they from like the Great Lakes? Like, how do we end up here? And like, our language doesn't really sound like other people's language stocks that were from like this area. And so when you think of having the opportunity, I am 25 years old, and I can say this is the first time in my life, this previous summer, that I got to see wild rice at the Great Lakes with my very own eyes. And that was a huge and an integral part of our culture. That's who we are as Anishinaabe people. And so when you think of that small example, it's just so huge, thinking of what this opportunity for many people like myself that are disconnected from these spaces across the country, for them to come into these spaces and be able to hear their language, hear these stories about like who they are and like where they come from. It's very powerful. So it's not just about taking care of a space, but it's also giving people the opportunity to learn about themselves and like their ancestors. And so with that, I wanted to talk very briefly, since I've already put out a lot of information that's probably like overwhelming. The last thing that I do, or like the other bucket of work that I do that is arguably equally important with the other work that I do in partnership with the Native American Rights Fund, is student competency and capacity development with NPCA. And a lot of it's in work with Michaela and many other folks that we're doing internally. And this is to talk about the stuff that we're talking about today, right? Understanding some of these histories, some of the legal components that kind of give you these pathways to pursue these opportunities. And a lot of it can be tricky at times, but it's been a very, I wouldn't say just humbling, but it's been a very honoring experience for me, because when I worked in the Park Service after my internships, I got to see firsthand like just the amount of lack of awareness or lack of knowledge. And it's not anything that people have done intentionally out of ignorance. It's just the society that we've grown up in, and like our education system of not understanding some of these histories. And more importantly, when you're in these roles specifically, you're not exactly given a handbook. At least it's kind of changed now, which I'm happy to see. But there's not a lot of guidance on like, hey, this is what you do when you work with the tribe, or this is like the policy that helps you do this. And so as it relates to our work, it's been really humbling because we get to educate about this stuff, but then also empower our folks internally, like, hey, as an NGO, this is how we work with tribal communities, and this is kind of like our lane, like this is our space that we operate in, we can do this work together. And it's been really exciting because and I feel bad, looking back now, I didn't talk really about the work I do with NARF. I just kind of gave you an overview of what co-management is, but a part of this role in both of the buckets of work that I do, a lot of it's just education and outreach. So there's times where I'll go like physically on the ground to park units, or I'll go to conferences and talk to both tribal and federal representatives of, kind of like what I gave today, just a quick and dirty overview of co-management, but then also the emotional component of like why it's important. And even in like the short period of time I've been with MPCA, just the level of internal we've done, the level of work that we've done internally, it's just been really insightful to hear the feedback that we've gotten, and a lot of folks just really enjoy this because when it comes down to it, a lot of it's not just about the work with tribes, it's the human experience and the work that we can do together to make sure these stories are told appropriately and accurately, and to take care of our lands because they took care of us first. So with that, I think that kind of wraps up, like in a nutshell, the many hats I wear proudly.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for all of that information. Okay.
Let me, again, we're so thankful for Katie and Michaela, is that right? For bringing this presentation to us. There are a couple of things that I saw in here that I want to just address really quickly. We hear the words thrown out there of federally recognized and state recognized, and we hear sovereignty, and we hear treaties. And sometimes those have been thrown out for so long that they've just become words and they don't really have a whole lot of meaning to some people. I will say, first of all, that when you look at the federally recognized tribes, and this is not in any form or fashion a way of denigrating anybody federally recognized, but typically the federally recognized tribes were the tribes that were rounded up and put into reservations and put on the Dawes rolls, and so they're federally recognized. And then you've got the state recognized ones that are set down below the federally recognized, but again, they are recognized by the state. That is by no means the only tribes that are out there. I know in San Antonio, at the San Antonio missions by themselves, there were over 200 tribes that were represented during the time that the missions existed here. And I know for the benefit of the San Antonio Mission Indian Descendants nonprofit organization, our leadership is Lipan Apache, and that's not a federally recognized tribe. Let me also mention one other thing, and that is the treaties, and that's going to be for a different presentation.
Mark, nobody can hear you.
You guys can't hear me?
On Facebook.
On Facebook, I'm sorry. The treaties, for those who have studied history, you'll know that the government came in and did a boatload of treaties with the Native American groups and honored almost none of them. And that is, those are things that we still continue to try to work with the government to make them an honest group so that they can recognize the treaties that they made with us. For the most part, the governments have been a little bit resistant to honor those treaties. We have seen some change in the last few years, and we're hoping to see a lot more changes. I will say that we cannot see changes if we don't apply ourselves and force that issue. It's not going to be easy and it won't happen overnight, but it's imperative that we hold our government to the fire and say these are treaties that you made. We honored those treaties, you didn't. So it's important for us to be able to do that. The work you guys are doing is important. I really appreciate what you're doing. And I know at another point, we will have someone else come and speak about how the National Park Services works with the non-recognized tribes. And we'll put that on the calendar and we'll all see that as well. But thank you again for being here. We appreciate you. I know it's a little cold out there. First presentation of the year. We are so thankful for each one of you who was here. I know that you probably had other things you wanted to do. Thank you so much for taking some time out and coming out here to see us.
This is what they wanted to do, Marco.
Absolutely.
I do want to make a point that when we say government, it's not everyone. Right. We have some amazing partners within the government who do come out and work with us and help us, and so we need to acknowledge that when we speak about the government, we not speak about the collective, because it's not everyone. So
we do have some really good partners.
Yes, we do have some good partners within the government that we're not, our organization itself is not federally recognized or state recognized. We're nobody. We're just a nonprofit organization that, works to ensure that our descendants know who they are and be proud of who their ancestors were and be proud of themselves as well. So we're thankful for those government entities who do work with us and don't say you're less than because we have
because
nothing.
there are some who have actually reached out to us and we've been able to reach out to them.
Yeah.
And together we're working on some amazing things for this year. And we hope to have your support as well, because everything that we do, we don't do for us. We're doing it for all of the descendants of the 5 San Antonio missions.
Yeah.
So we hope you recognize
We don't do it for us. We don't do it just for our family. And one of the things that I was speaking to one of our volunteers here this morning, and I want to thank City Year for sending volunteers out here. But I was telling him, because Louisiana, so be kind to this young man, is that when you're talking about the missions and you're talking about people who are native to San Antonio, we're all related.
in some form or fashion.
Somehow, we are all genetically connected. So you're going to come into these spaces and you're going to hear, hey prima, hey primo, hey cousin. Yeah, we're all related. Spanish, Canary Islanders, Native Americans, we're all connected somehow. We don't all know how, but we know that we carry the same blood in our veins somehow.
Because when you look at San Antonio 300 years ago, it was a much smaller space. The missions were their own little pueblitos, but those little pueblitos, you know, they all got together at different times. And so those people from those missions intermarried. So the Native Americans intermarried with all the different missions, and then after a while they were intermarrying with the Spanish and with the Canary Islanders. So yes,
including with the slaves,
yes,
that were being freed.
Mm-hmm. So as you're doing your DNA, you're going to find, oh my gosh, I'm related to Amy. But my point is that some people that you would never have thought that you would relate it to, and some of them are going to be saying, oh no, I'm related. But for us, it's
Hopefully
all plus.
not. Hopefully,
Yes.
if you see you're related to us, you don't say, oh crap.
I was thrilled when I learned that. And for them too.
So we were happy as well. So, you know, so we just want to make sure that people understand that what we do, our organization, what we do is for every single descendant, right? For everyone here in San Antonio to understand who we were, who we are, and who we plan to be. And that we work for you. We don't work, I don't work, well, I do work at home for my husband and my kids. But where the organization is concerned, I don't work just for my husband and my children. I don't work just for my sisters, my brothers. You know, I work for all of you to make sure that San Antonio and the state of Texas remembers who we are, where we came from, what we did, and what we will continue to do to elevate the Native Americans of this area. One of the things that I've told some of our representatives, and I want each of you to remember that our descendants of the missions, San Antonio is San Antonio because of you.
Right.
There
Your
would be no
ancestors,
San
yeah.
Antonio without the Native Americans of this area.
There would be no Texas.
And there would
honestly.
be no Texas without San Antonio and without the Native Americans of the missions. So if you're a mission descendant, you're a Native American mission descendant, be proud of who you are, be proud of your history, and speak about it and elevate it. So thank y'all so much for coming out.
Hey guys, we have so many things planned for this year.
Okay.
They're all really exciting. I hope that you will keep